those folks. All right, so we're in John chapter 8. Let me pull up a couple of things here. John 8 begins with a very well-known story. Very well-known story. What's going on at the beginning of John chapter 8? A woman caught in the act of adultery. So how many of you have a Bible right now where that story is maybe in italics or maybe has some notes under it? What's the note that's under that story? Okay. So without going into a long lesson about translation, we had Randy Bailey here last year and sort of told us a lot of those details. So when you're translating, you don't just have one autograph to look at, one original copy. Wouldn't that be so cool if we just had literally the original copy of the Bible and we could just look at that? Randy has an interesting theory, and I think it's kind of cool. He says that he doesn't think that those exist anymore because knowing the way that we are, we would worship the piece of paper instead of worshiping the words, and maybe he's right about that. What we do have, though, is a whole bunch of manuscripts that include portions. And so when somebody's translating a particular version, they may say, well, I'm only going to include something if it's in this number of manuscripts or this many or newer ones or older ones, whatever it might be. And so this portion of John chapter 8 is not included in some Bibles because of things that the translators chose. And so your question and my question immediately is, well, is this authentic biblical text? Number one, is this something that happened? Number two, should it be included on my Bible? So what do you think? A lot of you have studied this in the past. What's your opinion on this portion? Yes, what? Okay, why? Yeah.
In any footnote, I had a good fortune to be a personal friend of one of the NIV translators, and he was defending a lot of the things I didn't like about the NIV. Mm-hmm. He said, when you see the footnote, it means in the collection of scholars, somebody lost.
Yeah, somebody lost.
We'll give you a footnote.
It's interesting to use that word preponderance. I was called to jury duty in Pickens County where we live. I guess it's been about a year or so ago. Judge Weaver, who's been here for our Friends and Family Day, and who a lot of you know, it was a civil case, and she spent about 30 minutes explaining what preponderance of the evidence meant. And I thought, if I don't get out of this courtroom, I'm going to lose my mind. But it's an important term, right? Because if we say that a preponderance of the evidence supports something, then we're saying that the majority of it supports it, right? Any other thoughts on that, opinions?
I think what we have in the Bible is what God meant for us to have.
Okay.
I don't believe that there's something in there that he didn't think was necessary for us.
But that's because you're using that translation. Some translations don't.
Well, I realize that, yeah. But I think that when you put it all together, that and all the when you bring it together, I think God, this is what God meant for us to have.
Yeah, and I was reading a couple different commentaries on this and have in the past, and one of the things that one of the commentators said was that whether or not this was original to all the all the different manuscripts, it seems like a story that actually happened, and it would very much go along with some of the things that were happening during the day, doesn't it?
Well, either way, if it was in or was not in, it would make a difference in your faith of what was taught.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
the way you have to kind of look at it.
I do know, though, especially,
Well, I was just going to say that it's real consistent with the way the Pharisees and Sadducees approached Jesus. It's very consistent with the way he replied to them. Mm-hmm. It's also very brief. If you take a look at the passage, it's impacted us in ways that other stories have not. This particular one has.
Yeah.
And even so, it's very brief, and that's also very consistent with the way the scriptures.
Yeah. So you're talking about the impact of the story. Go ahead.
I just want to add, I hope you don't mind me referring to you as sisters.
Okay.
You were around before the Dead Sea Scrolls, at least the news of them came out. We had the same discussion on Isaiah.
Yeah.
And said, how do we know this is really the words of Isaiah? And people discussed that, and then all of a sudden the Dead Sea Scrolls come out, and it's almost letter for letter.
Yeah.
And so it's just amazing. All the evidence we accumulate as time goes on just verifies.
They were very small children before the Dead Sea Scrolls, Eric. No. So that is interesting. So something that Will said, I was thinking about this. So Augustine, who is one of the great theologians throughout history, says that the reason this would have been excluded was because, well, it's for a theological reason. Why do you think somebody translating the Bible might choose to exclude this passage on theological grounds? Something somebody might misinterpret out of it. Well, they thought she was a sinner, but what could this lead to? John?
Basically, an excusing away of sin.
Yeah.
Those of you without sin, cast the first stone. The majority of the time that I've heard that quoted, it's usually been someone that's saying, I am sinning and I don't like you telling me that I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And so until you can be sinless like Jesus, you leave me alone.
Yeah, right. And they would take Matthew 7, don't judge, and twist it and talk about how it's wrong to say anything is wrong. Another thing that Augustine said is that people might be able to explain away the sin of infidelity, because if they say, well, this woman was caught in the very act of adultery and Jesus didn't condemn her, so certainly my infidelities can be forgiven as well, right? And so Augustine theorizes, and this is a pretty important point, that maybe this was taken out because those people didn't want somebody to go to this passage and say, and misinterpret it. There's some holes in that argument too, right? Because if we wanted to, couldn't we kind of twist any little bit of scripture up and make it say what we want to and misinterpret it? Maybe so, but however you look at it, it's one of those passages that's debated, but I think it's an important story. And I've taught it as canon and will continue to do so. But let's summarize it, I guess. Somebody summarize the story, first 11 verses of John 8. Go ahead.
Jesus is basically minding his own business, and Pharisees and the Jews bring this woman to him, and they want to test him. They say this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. I do notice that the man was not brought with her.
Right.
That's interesting. And they're wanting to know what they should do with her, because the law of Moses demanded capital punishment or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so Jesus is writing in the dirt, and we don't know what he was writing. That he just says, those of you without sin, cast the first stone.
Yeah.
And their consciences are bothered, I guess, because of that. And they all one by one drop their stones and go away. And then Christ asks the woman, where are your accusers? She says, I don't know. He says, I do not condemn you either. Go and sin no more.
Yeah, it's such a cool story. There's a couple of details that jump out to me. So in verse 2, the first two words of verse 2 are at dawn. If we had a service at dawn, how many of you would come listen to me preach at dawn? Well, at least we don't have a lot of liars in here, so that's good. Thank you to this section over here. Y'all over here. But so at dawn, they're there, and they're here to Jesus they want to hear him preach. And so they brought a woman caught in adultery, and they say, she's supposed to be stoned. And it says even there that it's a trap. And so this is actually, without trying to go over the finer points of the law of Moses, actually an incorrect interpretation of the law. The part that talks about stoning and capital punishment would have been someone who was betrothed in marriage. And this woman is actually married. But she's caught in the act of adultery, and she's a repeat sinner, right? And she's somebody that is very easy to condemn her. It's very easy to, talk about how bad she is. She's one of those people that we would see as an outlier in society, right? Somebody who it's easy to perpetrate something against because she has no standing to stand up and defend herself. And so these people, they find her, and what always has stood out to me about this story is these accusers, and they bring her, and they have no concern for her well-being whatsoever. She is a prop and a tool for condemnation. And that's a really sad statement, because whenever we stop looking at people as people, then we've really missed the boat about what it means to be a Christian, right? And so they bring her down, and she's caught in the act of adultery, and Jesus bends down and starts to write on the ground. Can you think of any other time in the text or in the Bible that we read about Jesus writing anything. Anybody? No. This is the only time that we read about him writing anything. And then what happens to it? Gets, run over by dirt. And so that's another interesting thing about Jesus' writing. Another interesting thing that you read about is, when Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount, or Jesus is preaching this sermon or preaching this sermon, a lot of what we have are summaries of what Jesus said. Same thing is true when we read about Paul going and, for instance, you read Acts 17 and he's preaching to the folks in Athens there. That's not the entirety of his message, right? This is a summary of his message, because certainly Paul would have stood there and preached for hours like he did in Acts 20, as Lloyd reminded us of this morning. And so Jesus deals with the people, and I love verse 9. It says, "At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left." Why do you think the older ones would have left first?
They were more wiser, and they may have been the ones that designed the plan to start with.
Yeah, they would have been, number one, better students of the law, and they would have been a lot more wise and would have thought, well, we tried to get him, but he got us, right? And so from the oldest on down, they march away.
I think the Pharisees thought they had a win-win situation.
Yep.
Any answer he could give, either yes, we need to stone her, then they would capture Jesus and go to the Romans and say, this man is wanting to stone somebody.
Yeah, he's a murderer.
And that's against your laws
Right.
to deal with him. Or if he said no, then they would say, well, that's Mosaic law that we have to stone her, so you've gone against Moses. So they thought that they had him in something that he couldn't get out of.
Yeah. And doesn't that happen to us sometimes? Well, theologically, people say, I got him now. And so sometimes the best thing to do is to not directly answer a question. And Jesus was a master logician and teacher. John?
Getting back to whether or not this is an authentic, should be included in the Bible, this section. I read recently one scholar that was saying that this, to him, is the best reason why it probably shouldn't be, because it kind of goes against the Pharisees' nature. As they, as you said, they didn't really care about this woman.
Yeah.
To use her as a prop. Their whole idea is to trap him anyway, and for him to basically pierce their conscience to the point that they're willing to drop their stones and go away. The one scholar that I read said that doesn't really seem that realistic to the type of people that they were. It seems more realistic that if he had said, those of you who are without sin cast the first stone, if they were determined to stone her,
Somebody would have picked one up,
they
right?
would have just gone ahead and done it anyway. They don't really they don't really have much regard for his statements anyway.
Yeah.
So why would they follow through with that? So I found that very
Yeah.
interesting.
But going back on the other side, if they had stoned her, they would have been arrested by the Romans too. So it's one of those things that we'll, we don't know the answer to. But it is interesting to see that and read that. And I think that our best way of reading that particular story is to read it from the point of view of the woman caught in sin. Because really, we're not great teachers of the law. And we're certainly not Jesus, but we are just like this woman standing in need of forgiveness. And so I think that's the best way to read that story and understand it. And so,
They've been writing some about the Mosaic law. I mean, we don't know,
Yeah.
like you say, but where did they recognize and change their mind, change their heart?
yeah. One of the funniest things to do, I'll get you 1 second, John. One of the funniest things to do is go and ask different people what they think Jesus was writing. I've heard 100 different opinions about what he was writing and what it could have been, and it's an interesting discussion. And some people think they know, and if they do, then they have a special revelation that I haven't gotten yet. But John?
Did you say that this woman was married?
Yes.
Where did you get that?
That's it. Yeah. If she was caught in adultery, that would have been that she was married.
If the partner was married, then it is adultery.
Right, yes.
So the man may have been married.
Yeah, could have been. But when it says the woman is caught in adultery, if she wasn't married, we would think it would use the word fornication. But I've never thought about that before.
If either party got married.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it, Shane.
When I try to picture the scene back then, I think about the men that dropped their rocks. Probably were the ones who were having an affair with her too.
Yeah, maybe so.
They were trying to get out of there.
I wondered if someone was going to bring that up, and I've seen that speculated. And I don't know why we automatically come up with multiple partners, because maybe because it makes us sound more guilty, but to me, one would be enough.
Yeah.
And if that one was present, personally, I think you'd be hiding somewhere. It's like, I hope they don't try to do this with me if they find out.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that goes back to, let me see where we are here. John 4, I think sometimes it becomes an amalgamation, because if you remember the woman at the well, Jesus says to her in John chapter 4, verse 17, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you've had 5 husbands. The man you have now is not your husband. And so maybe that's where some of that comes from. But, I like what Shannon said. Whenever I'm thinking about this, and we've got this Jerusalem marketplace set up, I try to imagine the scene, right, and try to picture it and see what was going on. Because while certainly the situations and circumstances of that time were a lot different, human nature hasn't changed, right? And so I think that we can get a good view of ourselves if we're able to take ourselves back there. Okay, I didn't intend to spend that much time on that, but that's good. So John chapter 8, verse 12, this is our our topic for the night, and it's one of the topics that's being discussed over at VBS. So we're going to look at it in a little more adult fashion. John chapter 8, verse 12, Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. That's random, right, Jesus? What in the world would have made him say that right then, do you think?
That age was described as an age of darkness, and I think when he turned toward Jerusalem, his apostles were in amazement just before he was crucified that he was actually going back in there, and he basically turned on them and said, if you don't, in so many words, if you're not going to come with me, then you're going to stumble in darkness.
Yeah.
It was an age of darkness.
Yeah, so that contrast, when you think about biblical themes, right, that is one that is present from the very outset of Scripture, right? What happens in the very outset of Scripture with light and dark? God said, when there was light, right? So there was nothing but darkness, and then God brought forth light. And you go and you read so in all throughout the Old Testament. There's a ton of Old Testament references here. I'll read a couple of them to you. Isaiah 49:6. Isaiah chapter 49:6. I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou may be my salvation to the end of the earth. This is Isaiah 42, verse 6. I, the Lord, have called thee in righteousness, and will hold thine hand, and will keep thee, and will give thee for a covenant of the people, for a light of the Gentiles. Malachi chapter 4, verses 2. These are obviously King James references. But unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings. So those are obviously referring to Christ, right? And so light is present. You go all the way back to Exodus, right? Exodus chapter 13. What's going on there with light and darkness? Exodus 13, light and darkness. What's going on there?
Fire and cry.
Yeah, what happens?
God leads them.
So where in Exodus 13 are the Israelites leaving? Yeah, they've left Egypt. They've been enslaved. How long were they enslaved? 400 years, right? They're leaving that captivity and they're going out. And so they need to be led because they're going out to, a dark place in the wilderness. And so then all of a sudden they go and and all of a sudden there's this pillar of light in the air, and God leads them wherever they need to go around the darkness of the wilderness by that pillar of light. And so we can, I think, reasonably say that we have a pillar of light, and that's Jesus. Jesus is our moral compass, right? He's our light in that dark age that Will was referencing. I think that's very important. Can you think of a more contextual response, though, something that may have been going on specifically right then that would make this necessary? These I am statements are sort of shrouded in the setting, some people say this, of the Feast of the Tabernacles. And so these would have been things that happened, and Jesus would have said, this thing that's going on, I am that. And so a lot of people have posited that this was something called the illumination of the temple. And so there would have been this lighting ceremony. And this is a kind of just a crude reference, but if you think about at Christmas time when we have Light Up LJ and everybody gathers around and they light that Christmas tree, and you can't get through downtown for like a week, and there's people on top of each other, and even like I was a couple years ago, you want some yogurt from Abby's, but you can't get over there. And so think about it in that way. There's this great lighting of the temple, and it's this great spectacle, and Jesus says, you think that that temple is the light. You think that's what's supposed to guide you. But he says, I am the light of the world. I am the place that you need to follow. You need to follow me, and then you'll never walk in darkness. And so it's a powerful statement, one of those I am statements that we read about in John. And then, of course, if you jump down to verse 58, probably the greatest I am statement. Before Abraham was, I am. And what is that statement supposed to be about? Before Abraham was, I am.
Christ always was
Yeah.
at the beginning.
Yeah, and isn't that thematically important to the book of John altogether? That John, in John chapter 1, verse 1 said, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. It's the eternal nature and deity of Christ. And then Jesus himself proclaims in John 8:58, before Abraham was, I am. Or the NIV says, before Abraham was born, I am. What's their reaction to that statement in verse 59? Yeah.
They didn't like it. He proclaimed himself God.
Yeah. And so they're ready to kill him, right? I've always been fascinated by the idea of stoning. If you were to take a whole bunch of rocks, little rocks, it would take a long time to kill somebody throwing some stones. Number one, I've always thought, was there some stoning academy where you learn to throw fastballs and sliders and hit people? But number two, I wondered, where is this great supply of rocks that they're keeping to stone people, and how big must these rocks have been to kill people, right? Doesn't it sound like a very miserable way to die? And they were very stone happy. They said every time, somebody says something blasphemous, we're going to stone them to death, John.
Do you think that they took it, before Abraham was I am, do you think that they took that I am as a play on words for God saying to Moses, tell them I am has sent you, and they took that to be Jesus proclaiming himself as deity?
Yeah.
That's why they wanted to stone him?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what he was doing. He was proclaiming, I am equal with God. Philippians 2:5, we referenced that this afternoon up at the nursing home that it says that Jesus did not consider, robbery to be equal with God, or did not consider equality something to be attained.
In some societies in the Middle East, in years past, centuries ago, that had stoning would let the young boys start, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. They would throw the first stone, and they would be small. But, a small rock would hurt. Yeah. So they let them throw all their rocks that they wanted. And you're hurting all the time. And then the men start throwing the bigger rocks to kill you. Yeah. But that makes the suffering go on longer, letting the little kids throw the rocks.
Yeah, exactly. I watched a stand-up comedian. I wish I could remember which one it was. Talk about that. And it's kind of funny, but then again, it's kind of excruciating. People in ancient times were pretty good at coming up with torture, and so... It's a rough thing, and thankfully, but we read Paul did receive a stoning, and there are some people, and I think I'm one of them, that believe Paul actually died and was resurrected in that time.
We just have studied this in our Bible class about the woman adulteress, and I was looking online. Some societies, when they catch the adulterer, they tie them down and pour molten lead down their throat.
Wow.
Of course, they come up with all these different ways to torture you. I don't know.
Man, that's certainly rough, certainly difficult. Okay, so I think that we fleshed out this idea a little bit, this I am statement. This is one of how many I am statements in the book of John?
7.
7, good job. Is there symbolism behind that number of I am statements? Maybe. What does 7 represent in most biblical texts? Completeness, right? So Jesus, 7 I am statements of completeness. They could be, but certainly interesting. And so what we've been trying to focus on this summer in our summer series and in discussions like this is, number one, contextually, what did that mean? I think we've established that. And then, what does it say about Jesus? Well, it says that, that he is that compass to guide us, and he is that light to guide us. And so here's what we have to figure out in our a little bit of time that we have left. And I think we've got, that clock is not right. We got about 10 minutes or so left. What does it mean for me? And this particular I am statement has specific application for us. Why?
We are the light of the world in a sense now that we are showing Christ.
Yeah, and not even in a sentence, right? Doesn't Jesus explicitly say that? Where do we read that? Where do we read that we're the light of the world?
Matthew 5:16.
Yeah, Matthew 5:14 through 16, right? And he says, you are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. And so let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify who? Your Father who's in heaven. So we're told very explicitly that you're supposed to be the light of the world. And so what we've got to figure out, I guess, is how to do that. And I went back and I was looking at our theme from 2017. And I know we've slept a lot since then. But anybody remember what our theme was in 2017? I gave you a bunch of bracelets that went along with that. And some of you wore them for a long, long time. Shine. Very good. Some of the oldest people have the best memories. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves. People that discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, Eric? And so it was shine. And it was built around this entire idea that we're supposed to be a light to the world. And there was an illustration that I read way back then, and I've been sort of thinking about it. And it's about this light bulb. And it was made in Shelby, Ohio. It was in 1901. And do you remember what light bulbs used to look like in old times? They weren't incandescent bulbs like we just got rid of. They certainly weren't LEDs. Do you remember LEDs? Do you remember what they looked like and what they were made out of? I'm trying to think. Well, not tungsten, but even before then, they were carbon. You remember those old carbon filament light bulbs? They're now, since they're sort of regaining popularity again, some people will call them an Edison bulb. And you can see the little filaments, and so they don't really light up. Just the filament parts light up. And so this particular light bulb was made in 1901 in Ohio, and it's still shining today. It's still shining today. It's in a fire station in Livermore, California. And the Guinness Book of World Records, Ripley's Believe It or Not, they've all come and looked. And it was originally like a 60-watt bulb, and now it puts off the light of about a 4-watt bulb. And so it's just a little bitty bit of a light that's shining. It's actually been moved several times too, and when they screw it back in, it always starts putting off light. And so I think sometimes we think that I'm the light of the world, that I have to be this big, bright light shining all the time, and that I've got to make myself known, and I've got to be out there, and I've got to be this great defender of the faith all the time. And I think there's times for that. But I think that maybe the essence of the Christian walk and being the light of the world is that consistently shining little light bulb that's always there. I think about it like a night light. Of course, when in the middle of the night when you're trying to sneak around your house and not wake up a baby, you want to have lights that are there to show you where you're going. I was walking down the hallway the other night, and I had set a suitcase, and we came back from vacation down the hallway, and I was tiptoeing down the hallway to try to get something and not wake her up, and I tripped and almost fell and made this boom loud bang sound against the wall. And I said, you just sit there and freeze for a second, and then I heard, yeah, and I thought, oh, here we go, no sleep tonight. But if I go in her room, she has that white noise machine that puts off both sound and light, and so it's not a very bright light, but it can guide you where you're going. And when I have to go in there in the middle of the night to put diapers away or take the trash out or just go check on her, there's that light to go and see. And so I think sometimes that's what we need to think about. As Christians, it's not always about this bright, big light that puts on a show for everybody to see. Sometimes it's just that consistency and always providing that guidance. We sing a song, Let the Lower Lights Be Burning. When the lights are on a lighthouse, why are the lower lights more important than the big, bright, strobing light? It's consistent. And so when you're looking and you're trying to guide into shore, I've never driven a giant boat, but I've been told that it's those lower lights that you look for that provide the direction, John.
My nephew was a sniper for the Marines.
Wow.
And he told me that when they were training him to be a sniper, that one of the things that they taught him was if you're out there in Afghanistan, let's say, in the middle of the desert, in the middle of the night, it's pitch black. They will jump down your throat if you light even a tiny little match. Because the way that the human eye is created, the human eye in pitch blackness is attracted to even the smallest light, the tiniest little light. And so they were teaching him, when you're out there in the field in combat in the middle of the night, don't even set off a spark, because the enemy, way over on the other side of the field, their eyes will go to it immediately. Just that tiny little spark, and they'll know where you are. And to me, when you talk about the type of light that we are supposed to be, and you mentioned that not every Christian can be this huge illumination, that some of us can be just the lower lights, the smaller lights. Those are, don't sell yourself short if you are one of those smaller lights, because people who are in darkness looking for light, they will go right to you.
Yeah.
And you can lead them to Christ just as much as any huge light.
Yeah, because the big light is Christ, right? I think that's made clear. You think about, in Hebrews talks about this, the glory of the sun and the glory of the moon. Well, the sun provides light. It lights up everything. But how many of you during the day go, oh, look at that sunlight providing everything? But at night, when you're in pitch dark and it's that biggest, brightest phase of the full moon, how many of us stop and say, man, look at the moon tonight, right? Does the moon have its own light? No, it's just a reflection. But it's guided many of us, back home in the nighttime as well. And so, those lights are important. The darkest place that I'll tell you two places. The darkest place I've ever been is Bible camp at Backwoods. It's way up in the mountains of Alabama, close to Mount Cheehaw, and so it's just a very, very dark place. And this past year, instead of staying in the middle of camp where the directors usually stay, in this building that's fallen down and gross and nasty, and there's one little toilet's about this big and one shower for 6 guys to share, I went and stayed up in one of the new cabins up on the hill, and it was nice. Except at night when there's no light and you're trying to go. And so luckily we have some golf carts that you can ride up the hill. And there's 2 of them. One is really nice and brand new and has a bright headlight. And the other one is a raggedy piece of junk. And guess which one's usually available when it's time for me to go to bed, right? And so Joey Wilson, Joey and Hannah and their 2 boys were here visiting last Sunday. Joey is the brother-in-law of Margie Pettit. And so they came to visit Bucktown. And I was sad that I wasn't here. But Joey is an electrician, and so Joey rigged up this little bitty headlight that's about a 40-watt light bulb that's on the thing. Do you know how happy I was to have that on that golf cart so that I didn't run it off into the woods and into the ditch, right? And then Wednesday night, I went over to Ringgold to preach, and Carla texted me on my way home and said that the power company is doing routine maintenance tonight, and so the power is going to be off at the house for a few hours. Pulling up in your neighborhood, especially if you live in Talking Rock where we live, where there's no lights, man, it's creepy. It's like the apocalypse, right? And have you ever noticed how quiet your house is when there's no power on? Just creepy and quiet. And so when those lights come back on and that air conditioner kicks back and all that noise comes back on, it's a relief, right? And so I want us to think about it in that way when we say, well, I'm supposed to be a light. And it's not that I'm this big righteous holy example. It's that we as Christians, with the message that we have, serve as a safety, as a place of refuge for people that are lost. And Will mentioned that the first century was an age of darkness. In a lot of ways, we're living in a very dark time now as well. And we can serve as that source of light. All right, any comments or questions on that? I had a whole bunch more, but we can look at that another day. Yes?
I was going to say, I kind of see it differently. In verse 12, it says, I am the light of the world. This is Jesus talking about himself. He said, he that follows me shall not walk in the darkness, but shall have the light of life. Yeah. So if we follow Christ, we will have him. Mm-hmm. I think the lesson more is for us individuals. Mm-hmm. Instead of thinking of ourselves as a light to other people, it's just that he's there for us and in us so that we aren't walking in darkness. Yeah. And I feel like we do have the light. I don't feel like we're in darkness right now. Yeah. I think we have Christ, and that's the beauty of the salvation that we take on.
And and you're right, that's the primary application. I think sometimes, and I have a habit of doing this too, we look at, all right, well, what's this saying about how good I am? But what this is saying is how great Jesus is. And before we can ever think about the Matthew 5 passage, Shannon's absolutely right. We've got to realize that we have been given that safety and that refuge. And Jesus is not a dim light that barely guides us through the darkness. Jesus is the brightest light that radiates the glory of the Father. And that's absolutely right, and that's beautiful. And so that I am statement is very, very powerful. And this one I want to leave you with, and we're going to have an invitation song in just a minute. It's the last part of that verse in Matthew 5. It's that, now let your light so shine that men may see your good works and talk about how great you are, right? Glorify your Father in heaven. That's the point of everything. And I wrote the VBS material for our kids, and I wrote that we need to be influenced. We need to let our love show. We need to be letting our action show. We need to let our faith show, so that through our love and through our actions and through our great faith, that God can be glorified. And that's our entire purpose, like we've talked about throughout this year, is our purpose is to glorify God, and we do that by walking in the steps of Jesus. And so we're going to have an invitation. And it's a very simple concept. Are you letting that light of Christ shine in your life? Are you serving as that light to the world? If the answer is no, we have an opportunity to make that right. And if you're somebody and you're sitting there and you've been considering making that decision to become a Christian, it's the greatest decision you can ever make, and you'll have that place of safety forever. We can help you in that. You can be baptized and let your sins be washed away. So Barry's going to lead us in an invitation song, and if you need to respond, come as we stand and we sing.
There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you or evil a victory win? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, wonder-working power in the blood, of the Lamb. There is power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you do service for Jesus your King? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you live daily his praises to sing? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, wonder-working power in the blood, of the Lamb. There is power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb.
Thank you all once again for being here tonight. If you were not able to take the Lord's Supper this morning, it's prepared in the room to my right. You can go out when we dismiss in a second, and there'll be somebody there. Brother Lloyd will be there to serve you the Lord's Supper. If you are a parent of a child, you will go and see those group leaders. So those people holding up the flag of the color bracelet that your kid is wearing, those will be the people that you need to see to get your kid checked out. Please come and be with us the rest of the week, Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night. We're going to meet at 7 o'clock. We're planning to have a lot of visitors from the community and friends of our kids here, and our kids as well. Looking forward to a great turnout. Is there anything that we need to mention before we dismiss? Any other announcements? Please remember to keep all those in prayer that we mentioned, especially Clyde's sister Brenda, and also Jason White. And if there's nothing else, Brother Curtis, will you come lead us in a closing prayer?
Father in heaven, we continue to give you thanks for this day you've blessed us with. We give you thanks for all blessings of life. We give you thanks, Father, that we've had this opportunity to assemble together and to learn about Jesus being our light and the light of the world that dispels the darkness, and the great example that given to us in the Sermon on the Mount, that we're to as followers of Christ, to be that light as well, to dispel the darkness. And Father, we ask that we will always be obedient to your will. We thank you for the Bible and for what it means to each one of us, and may we follow it in our daily lives and in helping others and spreading your truth and building each other up and loving one another more. We thank you this week, Father, for this period of time that we can come together and to study more about your word and about Jesus and all the things and examples we have of his life.